I'm Clarissa Ward. I'm a foreign correspondent for CBS News, and for the past 3.5 years, I have been closely covering the civil war in Syria. In the beginning, the uprising in Syria was about a desire for freedom, freedom to choose one's own government, freedom to speak one's own mind. The people who were the driving force behind the uprising tended to be sort of young, idealistic activists. There was a lot of talk about democracy. And that actually changed once the Free Syrian Army formed, which was a group of soldiers who had defected from the regime, ostensibly to defend the people. But what actually happened is that at that point it really became a militarized conflict. And the fiercer the bombardment became from the regime side, the fiercer the response was from the rebel side. And then gradually we saw the arrival of the Islamists on the battlefield. And this really completely changed the character of the uprising altogether. When I first started going to Syria, nobody was talking about Sharia law. People were talking about freedom. The people of Syria felt completely abandoned by the international community. People were being killed on an enormous scale, thousands and thousands. The Assad regime was using air power against a rebellion that was essentially made up of farmers and greengrocers carrying light weapons. And so essentially you had these pockets of rebel-held territory where there was no real law, where there was no sense of order, where it was impossible to try to rebuild society. And so the result of that was that you had these almost lawless pockets, and it was the Islamists and not the international community and not the United Nations who were able to come in and fill the void and provide some law and provide some order. And initially the Syrian people were willing to allow them to come in because they felt that, okay, we're making a deal with the devil, but we need them to save us. 10 million Syrians have left their homes since the beginning of this conflict. That's nearly half the population. And that's no accident. The Assad regime has deliberately used these very crudely fashioned barrel bombs that are just cheaply made. They're stuffed with explosives and shrapnel, and they drop them over any densely populated area. There's absolutely no real targeting involved because there's no precision beyond the fact that they're looking for densely populated areas. And as a result, most Syrians have fled. The people who have stayed behind are most often either fighters or involved in the armed resistance, or else they are simply too poor to go anywhere else, or they're concerned. They don't want to leave their homes. They know that if they leave their homes, it's very possible that rebels will come in and take over their apartments or houses. They often will loot through their belongings. There's also the difficulty of trying to get to countries like Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon. Even if these refugees are able to make it there, the cost of living in these countries is very high. Many Syrians are very proud. They can't bear to live in a camp where they don't have any freedom, where they're not allowed to leave the camp, where there isn't proper education or sanitation. And finally, I would say that some Syrians at this stage, after 4 years of relentless bombardment and death and destruction, they're simply making a choice that they're willing to risk their lives and quite possibly die, but they would rather live the remainder of their lives in dignity in their own homes. The world has very understandably been focused on the fight against ISIS and the very real threat that ISIS poses, not just to Syria and Iraq, but to the neighboring countries in that region, and also, one might argue, the entire world. But against that backdrop, and with the world's gaze shifted towards ISIS, the Assad regime has continued these relentless bombardment of civilian areas, essentially with impunity, because there simply hasn't been the same level of focus and attention and media coverage on what the Assad regime has been doing. And that's really played to his favor as well. Now we see Assad being named as someone who potentially the international community will deal with in the sort of attempt to find a political path or a path towards a political solution in Syria. So in many senses, ISIS is the best thing that ever happened to the Assad regime. And there's a lot of bitterness from Syrians who feel that the international community stood by and watched as hundreds of thousands of people were killed and only really started to become actively involved in this conflict once ISIS came on the scene. These are the bravest, most resilient people I have ever encountered, and they have so much heart and so much grace, and they are so generous with their time. I mean, you can be in the most extreme of circumstances, whether you're under fire or whether someone is living in a cave, and they will still make you tea. They will still offer you a seat. They will still ask you about your family. They will still engage you and offer you all the hospitality that they can, in spite of their resentment, in spite of their anger, and in spite of the fact that essentially they've been left to die.